Frankl's point is that there isn't one answer to what the meaning of your life is. It would be like asking a martial artist, what is the best move in existence? The answer, there isn't a best move in the world. Every technique and move depends upon the practitioner. And so similarly, what is the meaning of your life? Only you can answer. Only I can answer for myself. But there is a general structure, and the general principle is to find a why. If you haven't already listened to the first episode I did on Viktor Frankl, that's episode 1. Check that one out because that one covers most of the story, whereas this episode is going to focus mainly on the second part of the book called Logotherapy in a Nutshell. If you're not already subscribed to this podcast, do subscribe on Spotify, Apple, or wherever you're listening to it. And if you are enjoying my work and want to support it, you can head over to my Substack. The link is in the description, or on Patreon, and become a paying member. And thank you to all those who are already supporting my work. Without further ado, let's get into it. For too long a time, for half a century, in fact, psychiatry tried to interpret the human mind merely as a mechanism, and consequently the therapy of mental disease merely in terms of a technique. I believe this dream has been dreamt out. What now begins to loom on the horizon are not the sketches of a psychologized medicine, but rather those of a humanized psychiatry. A doctor, however, who would still interpret his own role mainly as that of a technician, would confess that he sees in his patient nothing more than a machine, instead of seeing the human being behind the machine. A human being is not one thing among others. Things determine each other, but man is ultimately self-determining. What he becomes within the limits of endowment and environment he has made out of himself. In the concentration camps, for example, in this living laboratory and on this testing ground, we watched and witnessed some of our comrades behave like swines while others behaved like saints. Many has both potentials within himself. Which one is actualized depends on decisions, but not on conditions. Our generation is realistic, for we have come to know man as he really is. After all, man is that being who invented the gas chambers of Auschwitz. However, he is also that being who entered those gas chambers upright with the Lord's prayers or with the Shema Yisrael on his lips. That was an excerpt from Man's Search for Meaning by Viktor Frankl, and specifically the second part of this book called Logotherapy in a Nutshell. And I want to focus on this part because in the first episode that I did with Frankl, I mainly focused on his story, but also focus on the other parts, right? The will to meaning, the will to live, and all that. But I want to focus specifically on this part, the logotherapy section, because so much insights on how we should go about living our lives and how we should go about determining what it means to live in this world. So I quote from page 120. Logotherapy focuses rather on the future, that is to say, on the meanings to be fulfilled by the patient in his future. Logotherapy indeed is a meaning-centered psychotherapy. At the same time, logotherapy defocuses all the vicious circle formations and feedback mechanisms which play such a great role in the development of neurosis. Thus, the typical self-centeredness of the neurotic is broken up instead of being continually fostered and reinforced. One of the hallmarks for logotherapy is that instead of babying and protecting the patient, sometimes, Viktor Frankl says, the patient has to hear things that are uncomfortable for him, because it is in that discomfort, it is in that uncomfortability that he can grow, that he can see his life as it truly is. Otherwise, oftentimes the doctor, the psychotherapist, feeds this neurotic behavior of the individuals. And because of that, they are unable to see life as it truly is. They cannot see the ill effect their life decisions are having on them, their families, their friends. And within logotherapy, the one important thing, or the most crucial thing I should say, is the idea that the primary focus of the human life is the will to meaning. It is the force behind any individual's purpose, any individual's reason to live, even in the midst of the worst suffering that they're enduring. And it is this will to meaning which is in contrast to the will to pleasure, or contrast to a will to a life of homeostasis. And he says homeostasis, or a tensionless state, is what causes most of the existential dread that we face. And I quote on page 127, "What man actually needs is not a tensionless state, but rather the striving and struggling for a worthwhile goal, a freely chosen task." And what Frankl is getting at here is that we need something that calls us beyond ourselves, something that tells us that we can do great things, whether that's to change the world or to survive and thrive in the midst of chaos, in the suffering that we're going through, when we're in the arena, when we are battling the dragon. Because only a warrior, only somebody who has felt the calling from up above, from something beyond himself, will thrive in this chaos, will thrive in this tension. Because in this tension, he finds that there is a potential within him to develop great virtues, to defeat his vices, to overcome the lower man. And this is why Frankl loves Nietzsche, and specifically this quote from Nietzsche, which reads, "He who has a why to live for can bear almost any how." And this quote appears over and over throughout this book. And on this page, I quote Frankl, "There is nothing in the world, I venture to say, that would so effectively help one to survive even the worst conditions as the knowledge that there is a meaning in one's life." There is much wisdom in the words of Nietzsche. He who has a why to live for can bear almost any how. I see in these words a motto which holds true for any psychotherapy. And Frankl ties this idea of having a purpose, having a why, having a will to meaning, to our ability to thrive, to grow, because he sees the tension, he sees the struggles that you and I are going through as the means through which we can hone our virtues, we can hone our ideal self. It's here similar to Plato's idea of eros. If you remember the episode we did on the symposium, Plato Symposium, where eros is love of, right? It's love of the good. It's not love of ignorance. And the lover, in this case, the philosopher, is one that is in between ignorance and wisdom. And so it is his ignorance. It's the fact that the philosopher knows that he's ignorant, that he pursues wisdom. Or else the philosopher would never pursue wisdom if he knew that he has wisdom. But because he realizes that he is ignorant, he continually strives after wisdom, and it is this perpetual, infinite draw towards the wise, towards beautiful things, towards the good, the truth, that he continues to grow and grow. And similarly, Frankl sees the suffering that we endure as the pot through which we grow, right? It is the vase through which the plant is able to grow roots and grow up. So Frankl writes on page 121, "Man's search for meaning is the primary motivation in his life, and not a secondary rationalization of intellectual drives. This meaning is unique and specific in that it must and can be fulfilled by him alone. Only then does it achieve a significance which will satisfy his will to meaning. There are some authors who contend that meaning and values are nothing but defense mechanisms, reactions, formations, and sublimations. But as for myself, I would not be willing to live merely for the sake of my defensive mechanisms, nor would I be ready to die merely for the sake of my reaction formations. Man, however, is able to live, even to die, for the sake of his ideals and values. The point that Frankl is making in this book is relevant for us today in this postmodern world as it is for generally our nihilistic world. Because what he's saying is, if all our desires are just chemical reactions in our brains and our guts, then why the heck would we die for these chemical reactions? Why would we go and sacrifice our lives to save another person? Why would we die for our friends? Why would we die for our lovers? Why would we die for our countries? If all these desires, if our will to meaning is simply chemical reactions in our brain, are simply defense mechanisms or reaction formations, why would we do all these things? It makes no sense. For Viktor Frankl, his practice of logotherapy treats the individual as a human being, not as a machine, as we previously read in the excerpt. He sees the individual as an individual to be treated for himself, not as someone to be treated as a machine to give them a bunch of SSRIs or a bunch of other drugs to treat his illness. Frankl sees that most of our illness, most of our mental illness is tied to our existential dread, or what he calls existential frustration. And our existential frustration, according to Frankl, exists because we don't have a will to meaning, right? We don't have something to live for. We have nothing greater beyond ourselves. We are sort of trapped within our own making, living in a liberal society, liberal here meaning philosophically liberal, democratic societies. We can do whatever we want for the most part. We can climb social hierarchies if we want. We can pick up different trades. We can pick up different skills we want. We can live wherever we want to. We can have children out of wedlock. We can run down the street proclaiming that God does not exist and nothing's going to happen to us. We can do so many things in our liberal societies. But the catch here is that within this type of society, where freedom is seen as the ability to do whatever we want, to have no limitation on the individual self, we almost always end up getting bored. And Viktor Frankl sees this during the 1950s and 60s when he's practicing his logotherapy. He writes, "The existential vacuum manifests itself mainly in a state of boredom. Now we can understand Schopenhauer when he said that mankind was apparently doomed to vacillate eternally between the two extremes of distress and boredom. In actual fact, boredom is now causing and certainly bringing to psychiatrists more problems to solve than distress. And these problems are growing increasingly crucial, for progressive automation will probably lead to an enormous increase in the leisure hours available to the average worker. The pity of it is that many of these will not know what to do with all their newly acquired free time." Remember, Frankl is writing Man's Search for Meaning in the late 50s, and he is predicting the society that we are going to be living in, where the majority of us work 9 to 5. We go home, we never think about work again. You have Saturday off, you have Sunday off. And even if you work, say, a different type of time schedule, say you work 2 weeks in, 2 weeks out, say you're a traveling nurse, for example. Those 2 weeks that you have free, or the weekends that you have free, or the 5 to 11 p.m. that you have free, the majority of us don't know what to do with this time. The leisure that we have in this sense that Viktor Frankl is using, what he calls boredom, it's causing us more distress, is actually making our lives worse. And it's making our lives worse because, one, we don't know ourselves, and two, we haven't found peace with ourselves. And so the silence, the free time is gnawing at the back of our minds. It's telling us that we are meant to do more. We are meant to be more. We're not meant to spend 5 days of the week from 5 to 10:30 sitting alone, eating pizza, watching Netflix, and then going to bed. Or watching Netflix, spending time playing video games, and then going to bed. Your life is supposed to be more than that. So many of us are unwilling to change because we are caught in the comfort. We are caught in what Viktor Frankl calls homeostasis, right? We are in this tensionless state. And it is in this tensionless state that most of us will live out our lives. And sadly, most of us will die like this. But Frankl, what he's trying to do in this last section of his book is to jolt you awake, is to shake you and to make you see that your life is supposed to be more. And by more, he doesn't mean that you have to go build this great company like Elon Musk is doing with, say, SpaceX. And for Frankl, even something like that, of somebody wanting to do something beyond himself, as that of Musk or any of these other guys, it could be precisely because of their boredom that they're doing these things. They're doing it to silence the voice in their head, to silence the background noise, right? To silence the demons that they haven't overcome. The point is, you can go two ways. You can either go into the state of homeostasis where you're not doing anything and you're completely living a life of comfort with no desire to improve yourself, no desire to grow your character, no desire to defeat your ego. Or you can go the opposite direction and silence all this by focusing all your energy on doing something huge, like building a great company. And for Frankl, the most important thing is your will to meaning. What he means by this is to do something that inherently makes you a great human being. And not, again, great insofar as you are praised by the people around you, you're praised by the media, you're praised by random people, but great insofar as you are continually serving your community, your friends, your family. You're continually loving people as best as possible. You're continually becoming more patient. You're continually realizing that the point of this life is not to serve your own ego, but to serve others. For it is only in understanding that this life is not about you, but it is about growing your love, then will you have will to meaning. Then your will to meaning will go beyond yourself. So Frankl tells a story of a patient of his who is an American diplomat who comes to his office in Vienna. And this guy has had trouble at work, and one of his friends keeps telling him that he has to go and face his father because that is what is causing most of his stress and problems at work. And what this friend, or I should say his analyst, told this American diplomat was, the reason you are dissatisfied with your work as a diplomat is because you harbor some sort of hatred towards your father subconsciously. And this is why you aren't satisfied with your work as a diplomat, since you see the American nation as a father figure. And because you have unresolved father issues, you are now projecting it onto your work. And as a result of this guy finally, after 5 years of doing this, settles down and says, okay, I guess I have unresolved father issues. But then he meets Frankl, and Frankl talks to him. And after a few interviews, Frankl quickly sees that this American diplomat's will to meaning was frustrated by his actual vocation. And it had nothing to do with some sort of unresolved father issues. It was that this guy longed for something else, some activity that would call him outside of himself, something that gave him meaning, something that he could go home and feel satisfied in having completed. And Frankl brings up this point to push forward this idea that not everybody needs psychotherapy and not everybody needs logotherapy. And this example of the American diplomat is one where Frankl quickly realized this guy doesn't need either of those things. He actually needed something else, a different job, not more therapy. Whereas now, a ton of people think that they need therapy. And therapy has become a whole category for companies to take advantage of. There are tons of online therapy companies popping up, especially now with artificial intelligence, where people can talk to somebody else or sometimes a AI, and the AI can ask them how their day was, how they're doing, so on and so forth, so that people can feel like they're having a relationship or some sort of communication with another being. And these therapy companies, they charge their users $70, $50 a month, $100 a month, comparatively much cheaper than if you actually go to a real therapy where they'll charge, anywhere between $100 to $1,000 to sometimes more per hour. So spending $100 a month to have a therapist who's always available. Let's just say the therapist here is an AI who's always available 24/7, no matter what time, what day, they never take a day off, is completely brand new. And what it does for people is that they become dependent on these things, right? And for the companies that have these therapy companies, they profit huge from having an artificial intelligence agent, a chatbot essentially, who can work day in and day out without taking a break, without taking a vacation, no complaints. And at the same time, these companies are harvesting your conversation, harvesting everything that you're telling this AI, and the AI is going better and better, and also learning from your behavior and making you hooked onto the product. Because ultimately, these online therapy companies are products, and products are something to sell. And for products to sell, they need customers. And the users who are falsely believing that the AI therapies, these online therapies are helping them. And I'm not saying that it's not helping some of them. Of course, it's helping some of them. But for the most part, I'm in agreement with Viktor Frankl here when he says not everybody needs psychotherapy, not everybody needs logotherapy. And that means most people are falsely buying into this idea that they need therapy. I've seen ads of a woman sitting in a car saying, I just broke up with my boyfriend and so company having this helped me so much overcome the breakups and the pain that I was going through. If we take a moment and just consider what it is that this company is selling, it's essentially leveraging somebody else's pain, somebody else's story and their struggle to sell more of their product. And this woman who used this online therapy to help her overcome the breakup with her boyfriend, to me, is a sign that we in our society are struggling for a will to meaning. We are completely lost in the boredom, as Viktor Frankl says. Because if a breakup, especially as a young person, if you're going through a breakup and you need therapy to overcome it, there are much greater issues in your life that your therapist should be dealing with than the breakup pain. So Frankl writes, in a similar sense, suffering is not always a pathological phenomenon. Rather than being a symptom of neurosis, suffering may well be a human achievement, especially if the suffering grows out of existential frustration. I would strictly deny that one's search for a meaning to his existence, or even his doubt of it, in every case is derived from or results in any disease. Existential frustration is in itself neither pathological nor pathogenic. A man's concern, even his despair over the worthwhileness of life, is an existential distress, but by no means a mental disease. It may well be that interpreting the first in terms of the latter motivates a doctor to bury his patient's existential despair under a heap of tranquilizing drugs. It is his task, rather, to pilot the patient through his existential crisis of growth and development. And that is the hallmark difference here between what Frankl is pushing for and arguing for versus the therapy that we as a society have, where the majority of people are simply given SSRIs, giving some sort of tranquilizing drugs to feel better, to change the chemical structure of their brain artificially, but never changes the internal structure that's causing this dread in their life, this existential dread in his life or her life. And this is what Viktor Frankl calls the Sunday neurosis, right? And it is that when Sunday comes around, the person who is going through existential dread hates and is filled with anxiety, thinking about showing up to work at 8:30 tomorrow, because they know that their life is simply in a state of tensionless boredom, and there is nothing that they can do about it if they don't actually change their internal structure, if they don't actually address the will to meaning. And to do that, you have to go deep. You have to know yourself. You have to love yourself. You have to go deep, go down into hell to figure out what it is that you have to overcome. What we need, according to Viktor Frankl, is that we need our lives to be filled, or our lives to concern our will to meaning. We have to be fulfilling a meaning in our lives, rather than simply the gratification and the satisfaction of our instincts, of our lusts, of our desires, because those things are surface level, and you can satisfy them or you cannot satisfy them, but you can always be fulfilled in your life, even if you never satisfied your shallow desires, your shallow gratifications, if you have a will to meaning. But if you don't have a will to meaning, if you're not in pursuit of that, or if your life is not oriented around it, and if you're not living out your life, fulfilling your meaning, fulfilling your call, then what Viktor Frankl says is you will be filled with existential anxiety, existential dread. And it will not matter if you change your environment, if you change where you're living, if you change your settings, if you change your office around, if you got a new job, you will continually feel this dread until the very end, until you address it. And again, going back to why he loves Nietzsche's quote, "He who has a why to live for can bear almost anyhow." If you have a why, there is nothing in front of you that can stop you from living. There's nothing in front of you. There's no barrier. There's no obstacle that you will not go through if you have a why. The obstacle itself becomes the path. Right? The path forward becomes simply taking the step after step. But without a why, without a reason to live, then any obstacle becomes the end of the road for you. And what Frankl notices in his practice is that our lack of meaning has ultimately to do with the society that we live in. As I mentioned earlier, he writes at the end of one section, Having shown the beneficial impact of meaning orientation, I turn to the detrimental influence of that feeling of which so many patients complain today, namely the feeling of the total and ultimate meaninglessness of their lives. They lack the awareness of a meaning worth living for. They are haunted by the experience of their inner emptiness, a void within themselves. They are caught in that situation which I have called the existential vacuum. And what is this vacuum that Frankl has coined? Essentially, what this existential vacuum is that of people not having a sense of meaning in their lives. People who are depressed because they have no meaning. They feel like their lives amount to nothing. They feel like they're not growing. They feel like they're not doing anything substantial. They feel like they're not making an impact. They feel like they should be doing more. And that has precisely to do with the societies that we live in, right? We no longer have the same type of hierarchy we used to have. If you were born into a cobbler family or a bladesmithing family in Japan, then likely, say this was 500, 600 years ago, then you are likely going to be a bladesmith, apprenticing under your father and so on and so forth. But now we live in a society where you could be a bladesmith if you wanted to. You could be an engineer if you wanted to. You could be a designer if you wanted to. You could be a mason if you wanted to. You could be a carpenter if you wanted to. There is no stopping you. But because of that, we face an enormous amount of choice. So we're actually stuck in this situation where the paradox of choice has completely paralyzed us. And in this paralysis, we have created an existential vacuum for ourselves. So Frankl writes, the existential vacuum is a widespread phenomenon of the 20th century. This is understandable. It may be due to a twofold loss which man has had to undergo since he became a truly human being. At the beginning of human history, man lost some of the basic animal instincts in which an animal's behavior is embedded and by which it is secured. Such security, like paradise, is closed to man forever. Man has to make choices. In addition to this, however, man has suffered another loss in his more recent development, inasmuch as the traditions which buttressed his behavior are now rapidly diminishing. No instinct tells him what he has to do, and no tradition tells him what he ought to do. Sometimes he does not even know what he wishes to do. Instead, he either wishes to do what other people do, conformism, or he does what other people wish him to do, totalitarianism. The two states he mentions, that of conformity and that of totalitarianism, also speaks to our lack of individual courage that we have. We, in our casting out of tradition, we have also casted out traditional virtues because we believe that there is no objectivity. We believe that this idea of virtue, this idea of character building, all of this is just religious nonsense, spiritual nonsense, philosophical nonsense. But in reality, in truth, because we don't have these virtues embedded in us, and because these virtues are not embodied by us, when we are faced with existential vacuum, we are unable to act because we don't have the courage, because we've never had the courage. True courage is the ability to see the situation you're in, to know what it is you're supposed to do, and to act. The thought and the action become one. And this is what Lao Tzu teaches in the Tao Te Ching, this concept of Wu Wei, acting by non-acting, right? Action without action. When the mind and the body become one, you think and you act at the same time. There is no divorce between these two. And similarly, a few episodes we've looked at with the samurai, with the Bushido Code, especially with the episode with Inazo Netobi, he tells a story of how for the samurais, or he makes the point rather, that for the samurais, a man who has knowledge but does not act, to the samurais is a rotten vegetable, right? Or is akin to folding clothes and putting inside of the chest and locking it. Because what's going to end up happening is that it's true that there is clothing inside of this chest, but if you never wear these clothes, then they're going to rot. And so you might as well have never put it in the chest to begin with. And the samurais absolutely despised information hoarding. Right? They respected people who were acting. That's why the Japanese have a strong sense of craftsmanship, because that is, as a society, what they value. They value a craftsman because the craftsman applies his knowledge into the craft, and the craft itself reflects back the craftsman's input, and it changes the craft. It makes it better. Whereas in the West, we are completely far from this. We value the stock trader. We value the Wall Street broker over the craftsman, over the plumber, over the carpenter, over the artist, over the mason, over the mechanic. But when we consider what the values the stockbroker provides versus the craftsman's, it is stark. One is simply sitting at his desk with multiple screens, putting options and puts, whereas the craftsman is using his hand, using his mind, understanding the tools, building new tools, creating things that are not only beautiful, but that are also part of the structure of the society. It makes the society better, whether spiritually or whether physically. And because we live in this society where we care more and we value the stockbroker more sitting behind his desk, we are now stuck in an existential vacuum. And this existential vacuum is what continues to create more and more mental issues. And so Frankl writes, let us consider, for instance, Sunday neurosis, which we have briefly spoken about, and continuing, that kind of depression which afflicts people who become aware of the lack of content in their lives when the rush of the busy week is over and the void within themselves become manifest. Not a few cases of suicides can be traced back to this existential vacuum. Such widespread phenomena as depression, aggression, and addiction are not understandable unless we recognize the existential vacuum underlying them. This is also true of crisis of pensioners and aging people. Frankl is making the point that this existential vacuum exists across the board. It's not just people who are doing these white-collar jobs, but people who are also retired, people who are aging. And especially in the West, our retirees, the elderlies, we put them in old age homes, or if they're retired, they like to go down to Florida. They like to go live in retirement homes. But a few years into their retirement, many of the retirees end up becoming depressed because human beings are not made to live alone. This concept of retiring, this concept of not working, is very foreign to human being as a creature. If you're retired, if you can no longer work in any other society, you would still be part of a family, right? You would be part of helping raise the next generation, your grandkids. But in our society, we've thrown that completely out. So the grandparents live far away from the grandkids on purpose. And when they're too old, we shove them into the old age home and visit them once a month because we're too busy. And the same thing ends up happening to us. Our kids do the same thing to us. And so this perpetual cycle gets worse and worse with every generation. So in the midst of this existential vacuum, what do we do? What do we do to solve this? Viktor Frankl says most of the time what we do is not that we go and find meaning, right? Because we don't want to do that. We don't want to sit still, go deep, reflect upon ourselves, know ourselves, kill our ego. We don't want to do any of that. Instead, what we do, he says, is we seek after power, or what he calls will to power. And I read, sometimes the frustrated will to meaning is vicariously compensated for by a will to power, including the most primitive form of the will to power, the will to money. In other cases, he goes on to say, the place of frustrated will to meaning is taken by the will to pleasure. That is why existential frustration often eventuates in sexual compensation. We can observe in such cases that the sexual libido becomes rampant in the existential vacuum. This is the society we live in. Right? The will to money, for example, which is a form of the will to power. We want to acquire as many things as possible because we think that in acquiring these things, in possessing these things, we will somehow fill this vacuum, what he calls the existential vacuum. But we realize it doesn't work, but we'll still keep doing it until the very end of our lives. And in the meantime, what will often happen is that we realize this is not working. So then we go towards the will to pleasure. We try to fulfill every single desires. We try to fulfill every lustful desires that we have in thinking that if we can have this thing, right? If we can have this type of woman, if we can have this type of man, if we can have these types of sexual freedom, then perhaps I will fill this innate need that I have, this vacuum in my heart. But Frankl in the 50s, which is now almost 70 years ago, writes that this never works. So Viktor Frankl's call is for us to find our will to meaning. So he writes on page 131, ultimately, man should not ask what the meaning of his life is, but rather he must recognize that it is he who is asked. In a word, each man is questioned by life, and he can only answer to life by answering for his own life. To life, he can only respond by being responsible. Thus, logotherapy sees in responsibleness the very essence of human existence. Frankl's point is that there isn't one answer to what the meaning of your life is. It would be like asking a martial artist, what is the best move in existence? The answer, there isn't a best move in the world. Every technique and move depends upon the practitioner. And so similarly, what is the meaning of your life? Only you can answer. Only I can answer for myself. But there is a general structure, and the general principle is to find a why. And so the challenge for this week is to, one, understand what it is that you are doing and why it is that you are doing. For when we understand why it is that we are living this life, why it is that we are doing this type of work, then, only then will we overcome this existential vacuum. Only then will we no longer have Sunday neurosis. Only then will we be able to live lives that are worthy of living. The second challenge is to ask yourself whether you've confused your will to meaning with a will to power or a will to pleasure. Because if you're not careful, those two things can look very similar to your will to meaning, since you find much satisfaction in these two things, in achieving these two things, in attaining power and attaining pleasure. It's very satisfying to get these things. But if you confuse these two things, then what often will happen is that your soul will be filled with malice. To quote Jesus when he says, "What profits a man if he gains the whole world but loses his soul?" And the third challenge is to cultivate courage in your daily life, in having a reputation with yourself. If you said you're going to do something, then do it. Or another way of putting it, to have the courage to stand up for yourself. And this doesn't mean being arrogant. This doesn't mean throwing people and other people down. This simply means that you have the conviction to stand firm in the midst of criticism from others. For it is only then, it is only in the small acts of courage that you do daily, weekly, monthly, than in the times when you are called upon, when you see things that require great courage, then can your courage come forth. Otherwise, you live in a delusional world where you think that you'll be able to act courageously when the situation calls forth. And with that, I'll wrap. Thank you for listening to this podcast. If you're not already subscribed, do subscribe to the podcast. Give it a 5-star rating. If you want to support this work, if you found this work helpful, share it with a friend. Give it a rating. And consider becoming a paid subscriber on Patreon or on my Substack. The Substack is the easiest. And don't forget to subscribe to my Substack. Each week, I send out a weekly email with a condensed version of this episode. And once a month, so far, I'm writing an essay. Till next week, peace.